Chapter 1. The United States Before the War. Differences between North and South. The American Civil War, which raged from 1861 to 1865, had its roots in a long development that had begun decades earlier. To understand why the United States plunged into a bloody internal conflict, one must consider the deep differences between North and South that became increasingly apparent in the first decades of the 19th century. These differences were not only economic, but also social, cultural, and political. They concerned the self-image of the people, the structures of their societies, and, above all, the question of how the young nation should shape its future. In the North, an increasingly industrialized economy dominated. Cities such as New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Chicago developed into centers of trade, production, and finance. Factories produced textiles, hardware, and later railways. The railway itself became a symbol of progress, connecting markets and cities. This infrastructure strengthened the mobility of goods and people, making the North a region that was rapidly modernizing. Agriculture also existed as a matter of course, but it was diverse, small-scale, and more geared towards personal consumption and regional markets. The North attracted immigrants from Europe, especially from Ireland and Germany, who found work in factories and workshops. As a result, the population grew dynamically and the cities became denser and more diverse. In the South, the situation was quite different. Here, an agricultural economy prevailed that was strongly based on plantation farming. Cotton was the main export product, sold in large quantities to England and other parts of Europe, where the textile industry was booming. The South also produced tobacco, rice, and sugarcane, but cotton was the white gold that promised prosperity. However, this prosperity was based on the work of millions of enslaved African Americans who worked the plantations under duress. The slave system was the foundation of Southern society and shaped not only the economy but also the culture and politics of the South. The social structures in North and South differed fundamentally. In the North, society was more characterized by a growing middle class, consisting of traders, craftsmen, workers, and entrepreneurs. There were also rich and poor, but social permeability was greater, and the ideal of the self-made man found fertile ground in the North. In the South, on the other hand, an aristocracy of planters dominated, controlling most of the land, power, and wealth. A small elite of large landowners determined politics, while the majority of the white population lived as small farmers or simple workers. Many of them did not own slaves, but nevertheless defended the system because it was part of their social order and self-image. Slavery was the greatest and most unbridgeable contrast between the two regions. While slavery had been gradually abolished in the North in the early 19th century and a growing abolitionist movement was emerging there, the South clung to the system. For the planters, slavery was not only economically necessary, but also ideologically justified. They saw themselves as the guardians of a way of life based on tradition, honor, and hierarchy. Many argued that slavery was a divinely ordained institution that maintained order and even benefited the enslaved. In the North, on the other hand, moral outrage grew. Newspapers, sermons, pamphlets, and novels such as Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin made the cruelty of the system visible and mobilized a broad public against slavery. Politically, too, North and South drifted apart. The North tended to support a strong federal government that encouraged infrastructure expansion, protected industries, and regulated trade. The South, on the other hand, insisted on the rights of the individual states. Behind this demand was the fear that too powerful a central government could restrict or even ban slavery. Again and again, both sides clashed in Congress, and compromises were made to preserve the unity of the country. But these compromises were often only a postponement, not a solution. The West played a key role in this development. With each new expansion into territories such as Missouri, Kansas, or California, the question arose, should slavery be allowed there or not? The North wanted to prevent the power of slaveholders from expanding further, while the South insisted that new states should have the right to introduce slavery. These disputes made it clear that it was not just about economic issues, but about the fundamental question of what kind of nation the United States should be. Culturally, clear differences had also emerged. The North was more oriented towards education, freedom of the press, and religious diversity. Universities, schools, and newspapers flourished, and immigration brought with it new ideas and beliefs. In the South, society was more conservative, with a strong focus on tradition, religion, and the defense of one's own way of life. While cities in the North became centers of intellectual exchange, the South remained more rural and decentralized. These antagonisms did not necessarily lead to war, but they made the nation vulnerable to conflict. Again and again, politicians tried to bridge the division, whether through the Missouri Compromise of 1820 or the Compromise of 1850. But with each decade, the tone intensified and the ability to compromise decreased. When violence finally erupted in Kansas in the 1850s, when the Supreme Court ruled in the Dred Scott judgment that African Americans had no civil rights, and when Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, the division could no longer be overlooked. The Civil War did not arise out of nowhere, but the result of a long development in which North and South drifted further and further apart. Economy, society, politics, and culture had created two very different worlds that existed only loosely under the umbrella of a common nation. The contrast between an industrialized, modern society based on freedom and labor and an agrarian, hierarchical, and slave-owning order was too great to coexist permanently. Thus, the United States was on the brink of a war that would decide not only slavery, but also the future of the nation. The North and the South were no longer just two regions, but two worlds that distrusted each other and finally clashed in open hostility. Chapter 2. The Question of Slavery and the Political Division. Slavery was at the heart of the division that eventually led to the American Civil War. It was more than an economic institution. It was a social, cultural, and political foundation that defined the South and increasingly turned the North against it. From the early years of the Republic, it was a point of contention that repeatedly required compromises, but was never finally resolved. In the 19th century, however, the conflict intensified to such an extent that it divided the country into two irreconcilable camps. For the South, slavery was inextricably linked to its economy. The plantations that produced cotton, tobacco, or sugarcane would not have been profitable without the work of millions of enslaved people. Cotton was the most important export of the United States in the mid-19th century, making the southern states a decisive factor in global trade. The prosperity of the planter elite was based on this system, and this elite dominated the politics, culture, and society of the South. For them, defending slavery was synonymous with defending their way of life, their honor, and their social status. In the North, on the other hand, a movement grew that increasingly condemned slavery as a moral evil. While not all Northerners were ardent abolitionists, industrialization, immigration, and the growing ideal of individual freedom made the institution increasingly incompatible with the values of the region. Newspapers, churches, and activists denounced the brutality of slavery, and works such as Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin shook the public. Abolitionism was no longer a marginal phenomenon, but a moral force that influenced politics. Politically, the conflict was intensified by the question of whether slavery should be allowed in new territories and states. The expansion to the West repeatedly brought this issue onto the agenda. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, which banned slavery north of a particular line, was a first attempt to maintain balance. But the further the United States expanded westward, the more difficult it became to establish a balance between free and slave-holding states. In the 1850s, laws such as the Kansas-Nebraska Act exacerbated the situation. This law repealed the Missouri Compromise and left it to the new territories to decide on the introduction of slavery. This led to violence as supporters and opponents of slavery literally fought each other in bleeding Kansas. This showed that the conflict could no longer be resolved through political debates alone, but that it had already begun to turn into open violence. The situation also came to a head legally. The Supreme Court's 1857 Dred Scott ruling ruled that African Americans, whether free or enslaved, had no civil rights, and that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. This verdict nullified all previous compromises and, in the eyes of many Northerners, confirmed the power of the slave-owning elite. For the South, it was a triumph, but for the North, it was an affront that shook confidence in the institutions of the Republic. The political parties reflected this division. The Whig Party broke up over the slave question, and the Democrats split into a Northern and a Southern wing. It was replaced by the Republican Party, which was founded in the 1850s and took a clear stance against the spread of slavery. It became the mouthpiece of those forces in the North who wanted to stop the expansion of the institution, even if not all Republicans advocated an immediate abolition. The Democrats in the South, on the other hand, vehemently defended slavery and made it the core of their identity. The debate was not only economic and political, but also moral and ideological. Southern politicians such as John C. Calhoun developed a veritable defense ideology in which they portrayed slavery as a positive good. They argued that African slaves in the South were treated better than workers in the factories of the North, and that the system was legitimized by God and nature. This argumentation was met with outrage in the North, but in the South it strengthened the belief that one had to defend not only slavery, but also an entire way of life. The political debates in Congress became increasingly bitter. Speakers such as Charles Sumner, a radical abolitionist from Massachusetts, sharply attacked the slaveholders. In 1856, Sumner was even brutally beaten with a stick by a Southern congressman on Senate floor, an event that further deepened the division. Words became weapons, and the political culture of the young republic disintegrated. Meanwhile, the number of escape attempts by enslaved people grew. With the help of the Underground Railroad, a secret network of escape helpers and safe houses, thousands managed to escape to the North or Canada. These escapes made the reality of slavery even more visible and fueled anger in the South, which introduced increasingly harsh laws such as the Fugitive Slave Act to return escaped slaves. This compulsion to return slaves who had fled to the North outraged many and brought even moderate citizens to the side of the abolitionists. By the end of the 1850s, it was clear that slavery was more than a political issue. It had become an existential challenge for the United States. Two models of society stood in opposition to each other: a North that moved towards modern industries and free labor, and a South that clung to a system based on coercion and hierarchy. Both sides were convinced that the future of the nation depended on this question, and neither was willing to give in. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, who declared that he wanted to stop the spread of slavery, was the last proof for the South that there was no longer any security in the Union. Politicians had already spoken of secession, but now it became reality. The political division, which had grown over decades, had led the nation to the brink of the abyss. In retrospect, it becomes clear that slavery was not only a part of American history, but the decisive factor that plunged the United States into the bloodiest conflict in its history. It was more than an institution. It was a symbol of two completely different ideas of freedom, work, society, and humanity. And when these ideas became incompatible, the road to civil war was inevitable. Chapter 3: Expansion to the West and the Dispute over New Territories. The United States has been a country of expansion from the beginning. Even in the first decades after independence, many Americans dreamed of manifest destiny, the idea that the nation was inherently destined to spread across the entire North American continent. This idea combined national pride, religious convictions, and economic ambitions. But every expansion to the West brought not only new opportunities, but also new conflicts that led the country deeper into division. Because with each new territory, the crucial question arose, should slavery be allowed there or not? The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 had already greatly expanded the United States, and the following decades brought further territorial gains. The war against Mexico in the 1840s led to the incorporation of vast territories such as Texas, California, and New Mexico. These conquests were a triumph for the young nation, but they put the Union to the test. The admission of new states meant that the fragile balance between free and slave-holding states had to be rebalanced again and again. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was the first major attempt to maintain this balance. He allowed Missouri to be admitted as a slave state, while Maine joined as a free state. In addition, a geographical line was established. Slavery was to be prohibited north of latitude 3630 in the future, while south of it was to remain permitted. This compromise initially brought calm, but it was not a permanent solution, but a temporary solution. With each further expansion, it became clear that such lines and formulas could not absorb all tensions. The 1840s and 1850s brought the dispute over the new Mexican territories. The Wilmot Proviso of 1846, a proposal to ban slavery in all newly acquired territories, sparked a fierce debate. Although it never became law, it showed how deep the fronts already went. For the North, the expansion of slavery into new territories was unacceptable because it would have increased the political power of the slaveholders. For the South, on the other hand, the possibility of creating new slave states was essential for survival in order to secure the balance in the Senate and guarantee the future of their institution. The Compromise of 1850 was another attempt to stop the decay. California joined as a free state, while the territories of Utah and New Mexico were to decide on slavery themselves, a principle known as popular sovereignty. At the same time, the Fugitive Slave Act was tightened, making the repatriation of escaped slaves mandatory in the North as well. This point outraged many Northerners, who were now forced to support a system they morally opposed. The compromise brought stability in the short term, but it exacerbated the antagonisms and radicalized the public. The situation was made particularly explosive by the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This law repealed the Missouri Compromise and left it to the settlers in Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves whether to introduce slavery. Supporters and opponents immediately flocked to the region to influence the political decision. Violent clashes ensued, which went down in history as Bleeding Kansas. Settlers, activists, and mercenaries fought bloody battles. Villages were burned down, people were killed. Kansas thus became a harbinger of civil war, a territory in which national division turned into open violence. California also played a central role. Its rapid rise through the gold rush from 1849 onwards made it a key state. The desire to accept California as a free state triggered fears in the South of being permanently pushed into a minority. Each new free state shifted the balance, and with every step, the uncertainty grew in the South that the Union could be governed against its interests. The expansion also raised the question of the rights of indigenous peoples, who were systematically displaced, deprived of their rights, or forcibly displaced. While North and South fought bitterly over slavery, the indigenous people suffered from the progressive colonization of their land. The Trail of Tears and similar forced resettlements were an expression of a policy that placed the dream of expansion above the fate of entire cultures. This dimension of the West shows that the conflict was not only between North and South, but also had a dimension of displacement and violence against indigenous communities. The expansion to the West also made it clear that the United States did not have a unified idea of freedom. For the North, freedom increasingly meant the absence of slavery and the opportunity to achieve social advancement through work and education. For the South, however, freedom often meant the right of states to protect their own institutions, including slavery. These different definitions of freedom inevitably clashed when it came to the new territories. The political parties suffered greatly from these conflicts.
The Democratic Party, for a long time an alliance of North and South, began to break apart. The Whigs almost disappeared, torn apart by the question of slavery. It was replaced by the Republican Party, which clearly positions itself against the spread of slavery. It quickly gained influence in the North, which made the split even more visible. The West was not only a geographical but also a political battlefield on which it was decided which direction the nation would take. The debates about the territories were more than technical questions of legislation. They touched on the basic ideas of what the United States should be. Should they be a nation of free labor and industrial development, or a federation in which slavery had its place as a legitimate institution? Every new state that joined was a building block in this dispute, and every compromise only postponed the time of escalation. When it became clear in the late 1850s that the Republican stance against the spread of slavery was gaining more and more support in the North, the South saw its way of life threatened. For many Southerners, the Union was no longer a guarantee of their rights, but a potential instrument of their oppression. The West, which actually symbolized hope and new beginnings, thus became a bone of contention that brought the country to the brink of civil war. In retrospect, it is clear that the expansion to the West changed not only the geography of the United States, but also its political and moral landscape. It exposed the contradictions of the nation and made compromises increasingly difficult. The question of whether new territories should be free or slave-owning was more than a regional dispute. It was a decision about what values and principles would shape the United States in its future. When this decision could not be made peacefully, the path to war became inevitable.
Chapter 4. From Compromise to Conflict, Kansas, Nebraska, and Dred Scott. The 1850s were a decade in which tensions between North and South continued to escalate. What had previously been kept in balance by laborious compromises now broke down step by step. Political decisions, court rulings, and bloody clashes made it clear that the United States had reached a point where negotiation seemed hardly possible. Kansas, Nebraska, and the Supreme Court's Dred Scott ruling became symbols of this escalation. The Compromise of 1850 had not resolved the split, but only postponed it. The admission of California as a free state and the tightening of the Fugitive Slave Act had made the contrasts more apparent. With the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, the facade finally collapsed. This law, proposed by Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, effectively abrogated the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Instead of a fixed line limiting the spread of slavery, the principle of popular sovereignty was now to apply in the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. The settlers themselves were to decide whether slavery should be allowed or not. What initially sounded like a democratic principle led to chaos and violence in reality. Both supporters and opponents of slavery flocked to Kansas to influence political decision. Entire groups of activists, financed by organizations from the North or South, settled here, often not out of a desire to live there, but to manipulate the votes. Soon there were violent clashes, which became known as Bleeding Kansas. Villages were burned down, people were killed, and the territory became a civil war on a small scale. Particularly notorious was the Pottawatomie Massacre in 1856, in which radical abolitionist John Brown and his followers murdered several slavery advocates. Brown was convinced that only violence could eliminate slavery, and his fanatical efforts made him a controversial but influential figure. For the South, he was a terrorist; for many abolitionists, a martyr. Kansas thus became a symbol of the fact that the dispute over slavery had long since left the level of parliamentary compromise. The escalation was also reflected in Congress. In 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts gave an impassioned speech in which he sharply attacked slavery and its defenders. Shortly afterwards, he was brutally beaten with a stick in the Senate chamber by Southerner Preston Brooks. Sumner survived badly injured, and the incident caused outrage in the North. In the South, on the other hand, Brooks was celebrated and received hundreds of new walking sticks as a sign of solidarity.
This event made it clear that even in the highest institutions of the Republic, violence took the place of debate. While Kansas sank into chaos, the Supreme Court intervened directly in the conflict with the Dred Scott ruling of 1857 and made the situation even more insolvable. Dred Scott, an enslaved man, had sued because he had lived with his master in free territories for a long time and therefore believed he was entitled to his freedom. The case went all the way to the highest court, and the decision came as a shock to the North. The Supreme Court not only declared that Scott had no right to sue because African Americans are not citizens of the United States in principle, he also ruled that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. Thus, the Missouri Compromise was subsequently declared unconstitutional, and all previous attempts to draw a line between free and slave states were nullified. For the South, this verdict was a triumph. It confirmed that their institution was not only legal but also protected by the Constitution. For the North, however, it was a slap in the face. Many saw this as proof that the institutions of the Republic were dominated by slave power, the alleged conspiracy of the slaveholders. Trust in the Supreme Court and in the federal order collapsed. Radical voices, which had previously been only a minority, gained popularity. The Dred Scott ruling was also so disastrous because it virtually eliminated the scope for compromise. If Congress did not have the right to restrict slavery, it meant that it could theoretically spread to the entire territory of the United States. For many in the North, this was unacceptable. The Republican Party, which positioned itself against the spread of slavery, gained even more support as a result. Abraham Lincoln, still relatively unknown at the time, distinguished himself in debates with Stephen Douglas as a voice that clearly stated the moral and political threat posed by the expansion of slavery. The conflicts of the 1850s made it clear that the United States was disintegrating into two camps that no longer had much common ground. Any compromise only postponed the escalation without preventing it. Kansas was the bloody laboratory of a civil war that would soon spread to the entire nation. The Dred Scott ruling showed that even the highest institutions no longer offered a solution but had become part of the problem. At the same time, the feeling of threat grew in both regions. The South saw in the actions of abolitionists like John Brown and in the growing successes of the Republicans an attack on its way of life and its existence. The North saw the power of the slave-owning elite and the decisions of the Supreme Court as a betrayal of the ideals of freedom and equality. Mistrust, anger, and fear dominated the public debate, and the center, which was still looking for compromises, increasingly lost influence. In retrospect, the 1850s seem like an inevitable path to war. The political institutions that had tried to moderate the conflict for decades failed. The violence in Kansas, the attacks in Congress, and the rulings of the Supreme Court made it clear that the nation had reached an impasse. It was only a matter of time until the tensions would erupt in an open war. Chapter 5: Abraham Lincoln's Election and the Secession of the Southern States. The election of Abraham Lincoln in November 1860 marked the decisive turning point at which the United States plunged into the abyss of civil war. Although tensions between North and South had intensified for decades, it was only the election of a president who clearly declared that he wanted to stop the spread of slavery that led the Southern states to make the final break with the Union. The election campaign, the division of the parties, and the immediate consequences of this election reveal how deeply the nation was already divided at that time. The presidential election of 1860 was extraordinary in several respects. The two major parties that had dominated the political life of the USA had broken up over the slave question. The Democratic Party split into a northern and a southern wing. In the North, Stephen A. Douglas, who advocated the principle of popular sovereignty, ID, wanted to grant the individual territories the right to decide for themselves on the introduction of slavery, was a candidate. In the South, John C. Breckinridge stood for an uncompromising defense of slavery and demanded its spread to all territories. A third group, the Constitutional Union Party, nominated John Bell, who tried to preserve the cohesion of the Union at all costs without taking a clear position on slavery. The Republican Party, on the other hand, was united and put forward Abraham Lincoln as its candidate. Lincoln was not a radical abolitionist, but he took the clear position that slavery should not be allowed to spread further. He did not want to intervene directly in the states where it already existed, but he made it unmistakably clear that new territories and states must remain free. In doing so, he opposed the interests of the South, for which the possibility of creating new slave states was essential for survival. The election took place along clear regional lines. Lincoln received virtually no votes in the southern states. In most of them, he was not even on the ballot papers, so great was the rejection of him and his party. In the North, on the other hand, he won the majority, as the population here shared or at least accepted his position. Lincoln won the election with only about 40% of the vote, but due to the split of the Democrats and the electoral system of the USA, he received a clear majority in the Electoral College. For the South, this result was a shock. For the first time, a president had been elected who came into office without their support. They felt politically marginalized and feared that Lincoln's policies would mean the end of slavery in the long term. In the weeks after the election, the first Southern states began to talk openly about secession. The rhetoric became sharper, and the conviction grew that the Union no longer offered a safe framework for the slaveholders. South Carolina made the start. On December 20, 1860, the state officially declared its withdrawal from the Union. The reasoning was clear. The election of Lincoln and the growing power of the Republican Party were seen as a threat to the institution of slavery. South Carolina argued that the Union is a voluntary federation of sovereign states, and that one has the right to leave this federation if one's own interests are no longer protected. Within a few weeks, other countries followed suit. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas also declared their withdrawal. In February 1861, these 7 states formed the Confederate States of America and elected Jefferson Davis as their president. They adopted a constitution similar to that of the USA, but explicitly guaranteed slavery and enshrined it as an institution worthy of protection. This was the final end of the political split. Lincoln himself was in a difficult position. His term of office did not officially begin until March 1861, and in the months in between, it was the outgoing president James Buchanan who was formally in office. Buchanan, however, was weak, hesitant, and unable to act. He explained that the secession was illegal, but at the same time that he had no authority to do anything about it. This inaction allowed the Southern states to organize their secession undisturbed and establish their new government. When Lincoln finally took office in March 1861, he was faced with a union that had, in fact, already broken up. In his inaugural speech, he tried to calm the waves. He stated that he did not intend to abolish slavery in the South, but at the same time stressed that the Union was indissoluble and that he would not accept any further withdrawal of states. Lincoln appealed to reason and to the common history, but his words went unheeded in the South. Secession was not only a political but also a symbolic act for the Southern states. They saw themselves as defenders of a way of life based on honor, tradition, and the institution of slavery. Many planters and politicians were convinced that the South was stronger and morally superior. It was hoped that the economic power of cotton would draw European nations, especially Britain and France, to the side of the Confederation. However, this conviction that King Cotton dominated the world economy was to prove to be an illusion. For the North, secession was an attack on the foundations of the Republic. The idea that individual states could leave at will called into question the entire idea of a federal union. Many Northerners, who might still have been willing to tolerate slavery, were not willing to give up the unity of the nation. For them, the Union was more than a treaty, it was a national project that could not be dismembered. The election of Lincoln and the secession of the Southern states made it clear that the United States could no longer exist in its former form. Two irreconcilable ideas of society and nation stood in opposition to each other. One saw slavery as an institution that had to be protected and expanded. The other saw in her an evil that should at least be stopped. The election of Lincoln was the trigger, but the causes lay deeper. For decades, the contradictions had intensified, compromises had failed, and trust had been broken. In the spring of 1861, it was clear that the political split would soon lead to a military conflict. The question was no longer when war would occur, but only when and where it would begin.
Chapter 6. The Founding of the Confederation and the First Reactions. After the first 7 Southern states declared their withdrawal from the Union between December 1860 and February 1861, the division of the United States was no longer just a political threat, but a reality. The new political entity, the Confederate States of America, was created to provide an alternative to the existing Union. In Montgomery, Alabama, representatives of the secessionized states met and adopted a constitution that was similar in many ways to that of the United States, but with one crucial difference. It explicitly guaranteed slavery and made it an immutable part of the new order. While the U.S. Constitution largely avoided the issue of slavery, the Confederates openly named it as the foundation of their society. Jefferson Davis, a veteran Mississippi politician who had previously served as Secretary of War in the United States Cabinet, was elected President of the Confederacy. Davis was not a passionate revolutionary like some other Southerners, but a pragmatic military man who defended slavery and the rights of individual states without compromise. At his side, Alexander Stephens of Georgia became vice president, declaring in an infamous speech that the new government rests on the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man and that slavery is his natural and normal position. With this, Stephens bluntly formulated what many had known for a long time. The Confederacy was first and foremost a state based on slavery. The founding of the Confederation was received in the South with a mixture of pride, optimism, and uncertainty. Many people felt liberated from a union that they increasingly perceived as hostile to their way of life. Newspapers celebrated the courage to self-determination, militias marched, and flags with the new symbol of the Confederation fluttered over the cities. At the same time, however, it was clear that this step was risky. No one knew whether the Union would accept the exit, and the economic consequences were uncertain. The first reactions in the North were marked by shock and indignation. Although many Northerners had long believed that the threats of the South were empty words, it was now obvious that the Union was in danger of breaking apart. President James Buchanan, who was still in office, was unable to find a clear line. He declared that secession was illegal, but at the same time that he had no authority to prevent it by force. This hesitation acted as a vacuum that allowed the Southern states to build their new government without serious resistance. When Abraham Lincoln took office in March 1861, the situation was already solidified. In his inaugural speech, he tried to find a balance. He emphasized that he had no intention of abolishing slavery in the existing Southern states, but that he considered the Union to be indissoluble. For Lincoln, the withdrawal of the states was not only illegal, but also a threat to the entire Republican idea. If a part of the Union could simply leave whenever it was dissatisfied with the outcome of the election, then the entire system of democracy was endangered. He appealed to the South to return to the Union, but made it clear that he would enforce the authority of the federal government by force if necessary. The reactions in Europe were closely monitored. Great Britain and France in particular, which were heavily dependent on the cotton of the South, looked at the developments with interest. Many Southerners believed that the King Cotton policy made them indispensable to European industry and that the great powers would therefore soon recognize them. But in the first few months, European governments held back. They hoped that the crisis could perhaps be solved without open war after all. Meanwhile, the Confederacy prepared militarily.
It took control of many forts, arsenals, and customs stations on its territory. New flags flew in the ports, and soldiers of the Confederate militias took power. But one symbol remained in the hands of the Union: Fort Sumter in the port of Charleston. This fort was held by federal troops, and its presence right in the heart of the Confederacy was unbearable for many Southerners. The conflict over Fort Sumter was soon to become the spark that ignited the war. In the North, there was still a certain indecision at the beginning. Many citizens were not enthusiastic about the prospect of war. Some even thought that the Southern states should be let go if they insisted so much. But others warned that this would mean the end of the Union. The United States would no longer be united, but only a loose alliance of states without a common authority. It was clear to Lincoln that such a concession would destroy the Republic. The first months of 1861, therefore, were marked by a strange mixture of normality and crisis. While political debates were being held in Washington, new governments and armies were organizing themselves in the South. Newspapers on both sides stirred up emotions. The South spoke of freedom and self-determination, the North of betrayal and duty to defend the Union. It was a time when many people felt that war was inevitable, even if they did not yet want to admit it. The founding of the Confederation marked not only a political division, but also a deep cultural and ideological break. The South consciously defined itself as different, as the bearer of its own civilization that was different from that of the North. This identity was celebrated in speeches, songs, and symbols. But it was also fragile, because it was based on an institution that had come under increasing criticism worldwide. In the North, secession initially led to uncertainty, but then to a wave of nationalism. When it became clear that the unity of the nation was threatened, many people developed a new loyalty to the Union. They saw it not only as a political union, but as a national project that could not be allowed to break up. This idea was to play a decisive role in the coming years, when hundreds of thousands were prepared to risk their lives for the Union. Thus, in the spring of 1861, the United States was on the verge of a turning point. The creation of the Confederation was a challenge that could not be ignored. Both sides saw their existence threatened, and both were determined to defend their position. The path to war had thus become inevitable, and only the first shot was missing to make it a reality.
Chapter 7. The Beginning of the War. Fort Sumter and the Mobilization. The open outbreak of the American Civil War began in April 1861 with the shelling of Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. This event was not only militarily significant, but also symbolic. It marked the final break between North and South and turned a political crisis into an armed conflict. The development towards this first shot was marked by mistrust, threats, and the firm will of both sides not to give up their position. Fort Sumter was a small but strategically important bulwark located in the middle of Charleston Harbor. After the secession of South Carolina in December 1860, it remained in the hands of Union troops under Major Robert Anderson. For Southerners, the presence of this garrison was a constant affront, as they saw it as a symbol of the Union's continued authority over their territory. At the same time, it was a question of honor for the Union not to give up this fort without a fight. President Buchanan had tried to supply the fort but had failed, and so it was up to Abraham Lincoln to make a decision after taking office in March 1861. Lincoln was faced with a dilemma. On the one hand, he did not want to provoke war, and on the other hand, he could not give the impression that the German government would simply give in. If he gave up Fort Sumter without resisting, it would undermine the authority of the Union and encourage other states to secession. However, if he tried to hold the fort by force, he risked open war. In the end, he decided on a middle course. He announced that he would only supply the fort with food, but not with additional weapons or soldiers. In doing so, he deliberately left the decision up to the Confederates. They could accept the delivery or fire the first shot. The Confederates under President Jefferson Davis were now faced with a difficult choice. Many in the South demanded that Fort Sumter finally be conquered in order to demonstrate their own sovereignty.
others warned that an attack would make them appear as aggressors. In the end, Davis decided to escalate. On April 12, 1861, Confederate troops under the command of General P.G.T. Beauregard opened fire on the fort. They bombed the facility for 34 hours until Major Anderson finally surrendered. There were no deaths during the shelling, but the symbolic effect was enormous. With the fall of Fort Sumter, war had become inevitable. In the North, the event triggered a wave of patriotism. Many citizens who had previously been hesitant or indifferent now saw the Union directly attacked. Lincoln called 75,000 volunteers to arms to put down the rebellion. Within a few days, far more men than needed came forward. Newspapers reported an almost euphoric mood in many cities in the North, where men proudly joined the army and women sold flags or collected donations. But Lincoln's call also had another, unforeseen effect. 4 other Southern states that had previously hesitated now joined the Confederacy: Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. For many people in these states, the attack on Fort Sumter was an act of Confederacy, but Lincoln's call for the states to provide troops to suppress the rebellion was understood as an attack on their own sovereignty. This brought the Confederation to 11 member states. The accession of Virginia was particularly important, as it was one of the most populous and economically strongest Southern states. It was also home to Richmond, which soon became the capital of the Confederacy. The mobilization of both sides began at breathtaking speed. In the North, new regiments were formed, and young men from all social classes volunteered. The majority of them believed that the war would only last a few months. Many were convinced that the Union troops could quickly put down the uprising with their superior force. In the South, the mood was similarly self-confident. The defenders of the Confederacy believed that their superior motivation and military tradition would lead them to victory. Here, too, hardly anyone thought that the war would last 4 years and claim hundreds of victims. The first months after Fort Sumter were marked by organizational chaos. Both sides had to build their armies practically from nothing. Although the Union had more soldiers, industries, and railways, it lacked experience, equipment, and leadership. While the Confederacy had fewer resources, it had a number of talented officers who had resigned from the U.S. Army, including Robert E. Lee, who would soon become a key figure in the South. The mood in the cities reflected the new reality. There was hectic activity in Washington when the capital was suddenly within range of enemy troops. In Richmond, the dawn of a supposedly glorious future was celebrated. Parades were organized in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, and volunteer regiments marched through the streets. But beneath the surface, the situation was more complicated. In the North, there were also voices opposed to the war, especially Democrats, who were skeptical of Lincoln's policies. In the South, there were regions, especially in the mountainous countries of Virginia or Tennessee, where support for Confederacy was not unanimous. The international community followed the events with suspense. In Europe, people wondered whether the United States, which had hitherto been regarded as the model of a successful republic, would break up because of its internal contradictions. Great Britain and France in particular watched closely, as their textile industries depended heavily on the cotton of the South. But they still held back, unsure if the Confederacy would last permanently. The decision to go to war also brought a deep social cut. Families were torn apart. Friends and neighbors were suddenly on different sides. Especially in border states such as Kentucky, Missouri, or Maryland, which did not officially join the Confederacy but were also divided, the conflict quickly turned into a civil war in the truest sense of the word. Here, brothers fought brothers, and loyalties were constantly questioned. The beginning of the war was thus not a short upheaval, but the prelude to a long, bitter conflict. With the shelling of Fort Sumter, the Confederates had fired the first shot, but the Union accepted the challenge and mobilized its vast resources. Both sides were convinced that they were right and that they would win. The war that now unfolded was to fundamentally change the United States, politically, socially, and morally.
Chapter 8: The First Battles, Bull Run, and the Disillusionment. When the first soldiers entered the camps in the spring and summer of 1861, the mood in both North and South was characterized by enthusiasm and self-confidence. Many volunteers volunteered in the belief that the war would be a short and glorious campaign. In Washington, it was believed that the Union troops could put down the uprising with a single decisive blow, while in the South, there was an expectation that the brave defenders would quickly assert their homeland against any threat. But the first major battles of the Civil War, especially the Battle of Bull Run, shattered these illusions and made it clear to both sides that the conflict would be long, bloody, and merciless. In July 1861, public opinion in Washington urged the leadership to go on the offensive. The press and many politicians demanded that the rebels be defeated quickly before they could consolidate. Under this pressure, General Irvin McDowell, who commanded the Union troops, ordered the march south to attack the Confederate Army at Manassas Junction in Virginia. The aim was to open the way to Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, and to decide the war early. The Union troops, about 35,000 strong, were inexperienced and poorly trained. Many soldiers had only a few weeks of training behind them and were not yet used to the hard life in the field. Nevertheless, they marched with confidence, accompanied by civilians from Washington who came along as spectators to watch the spectacle. On hills near the front, politicians, businessmen, and their families sat with picnic baskets, expecting a quick victory. The Confederates under General P.G.T. Beauregard and Joseph E. Johnston had amassed about 32,000 men. They too were largely inexperienced, but they fought close to home and were determined to stop the Union's advance. On July 21, 1861, the two armies met at Bull Run, a small river near Manassas. The battle began with an attack by Union troops, who initially gained some advantages and pushed back the Confederates. It looked as if the rebel line could collapse. But then General Thomas Jonathan Jackson intervened with his brigade and stood firm. He resolutely formed his men and instructed them to defend the line. His indomitable resistance earned him the nickname Stonewall, a name that soon became legendary. Jackson's example encouraged the Confederates, and reinforcements arrived in time. In the afternoon, the tide turned. The Union troops, exhausted and poorly coordinated, began to retreat. When the Confederates counterattacked, the retreat turned into a panicked flight. Soldiers threw away their weapons, civilians rushed back to Washington, and the streets were filled with chaos. The Union suffered a heavy defeat, which showed that the war was by no means as easy to win as many had hoped. The Battle of Bull Run had not only military but also psychological consequences. In the North, the defeat caused horror. The idea of a quick victory was shattered, and many realized that the Union was facing a long and difficult war. At the same time, the determination to prepare better grew. Lincoln called up new troops and appointed General George B. McClellan as Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the Potomac. McClellan was a capable organizer who disciplined and built up the army, but his exaggerated caution and propensity to delay would later lead to major problems. In the South, Bull Run was celebrated as a great triumph. Newspapers praised the courage of the soldiers, and many Southerners believed that the victory was a sign that their independence was assured. But this exuberance was also deceptive. The Confederates were also inexperienced, and their army was unable to use the victory strategically. Instead of following the Union's retreat to Washington, they stayed on the battlefield and celebrated. The opportunity to perhaps have a decisive influence on the war at an early stage was missed. In the following months, there were further smaller battles on various fronts, but they showed the same pattern: inexperienced troops, chaotic processes, and high losses. Especially in the West along the Mississippi, the first battles began for control of rivers and railroads, which were strategically important for both sides. But the main focus was still on Virginia, where the two main armies faced each other. The Battle of Bull Run also led to a rethink among the population.
Many young men who had previously gone to war recklessly now recognized the harshness and cruelty of the fight. Stories of deaths, wounded, and chaotic retreats spread through the cities. Families who had proudly bid farewell to their sons began to understand that the war would claim victims that no one had wanted to suspect. Lincoln understood the significance of this lesson. He began to understand the war as a serious, protracted conflict that could not be won with volunteers alone. The government of the Union initiated measures to align the economy more strongly with the war, to produce weapons, and to improve infrastructure. In the South, Jefferson Davis also tried to organize the war effort, but limited resources and the strong emphasis on state rights made it difficult to achieve a unified strategy. The disillusionment after the first battles affected both sides. The myth of a quick victory was destroyed, and the reality of a bitter war emerged. For the CDU, the defeat was an incentive to prepare better and to systematically use their superiority and resources. For the Confederacy, the victory was a moral boost, but it also created a dangerous self-confidence that hampered their efforts in the months that followed. Bull Run was more than a military episode. It was a turning point in the nation's consciousness. The Civil War was no longer a patriotic excursion, but a life-and-death struggle that would shake both societies to the core. The disillusionment after the first battles was painful, but necessary to realize that the conflict would last not only for months, but for years, and would change the depth of the country.
Chapter 9. Strategy and Tactics, North versus South. The American Civil War was not only a conflict between two social systems, but also a conflict in which different strategies and military approaches collided. From the beginning, both sides were faced with the question of how the war should be waged and how it should be won. While the Union sought its strength in numbers, industry, and infrastructure, the Confederation relied on defense, determination, and the hope of breaking the moral and political resilience of the North. The strategies and tactics that developed from these different starting points had a decisive influence on the course of the war. From the outset, the Union had huge advantages in terms of resources. The North had a much larger population, which not only provided more soldiers, but also more workers for industry and agriculture. Industrialization was well advanced in the North. Arms factories, railways, shipyards, and a modern financial economy formed a basis that far surpassed the South. The fleet was also clearly superior, which opened up the possibility of blocking the ports of the South and isolating it economically. From these advantages, the so-called Anaconda strategy developed, which was largely designed by General Winfield Scott. It envisioned cutting off the South's export and import opportunities through a naval blockade and at the same time controlling the Mississippi River in order to split the Confederacy in two. This strategy was reminiscent of a giant snake that slowly and inexorably crushed its opponent. Scott was initially ridiculed for his caution, but as the war progressed, his approach proved far-sighted and successful. The South, on the other hand, relied on a completely different strategy. Since he was outnumbered and economically inferior, he was unable to wage a full-scale war of aggression. Instead, the Confederation relied on defense. It wanted to hold on to its territory, involve the North in costly battles, and weaken its resolve. The hope was that at some point the North would shy away from the costs of the war and be willing to negotiate. This strategy was also plausible because the South did not have to conquer, but only had to prevent being conquered. A central component of the Southern strategy was also the hope of international recognition. The leadership of the Confederation was convinced that the European textile industry was so dependent on the cotton of the South that countries such as Great Britain and France could not remain neutral for long. They expected that diplomatic or even military assistance from Europe would put pressure on the North and secure the independence of the South. But this hope was not to be fulfilled, partly because slavery had become increasingly unbearable for the European powers. Tactically, the two sides also differed. The Union had to invade enemy territory to win the war. This meant long supply lines, difficult marches, and fighting in unknown terrain.
The Confederacy, on the other hand, was able to rely on the support of the local population, make better use of the terrain, and assert itself in a defensive position. Many of its generals were experienced officers who had resigned from the U.S. Army, and they knew how to use the advantage of the defensive skillfully. The first years of the war were therefore marked by this asymmetry. While the Union tried to achieve decisive victories through major offensives, the South relied on skillful maneuvers to fend off these offensives and demoralize the opponent. Battles such as Bull Run showed that the Union troops, despite their numerical superiority, were not easily able to defeat the Confederacy. Another decisive factor was the railway. The North had a dense network that could quickly transport troops and supplies. The South also had railways, but they were sparse, poorly maintained, and often incompatible because different gauges were used. This made coordination and care considerably more difficult. Nevertheless, the Southerners knew how to use their existing resources skillfully and achieve surprise effects. Warfare was also characterized by a mixture of old-fashioned tactics and modern technology. Many generals had received their training at a time when line infantry and cavalry attacks were the norm. But the technology had evolved. New rifles with rifled barrels, longer-range artillery, and the beginning use of telegraphs and railways fundamentally changed warfare. This discrepancy meant that losses were often alarmingly high. Attacks in closed formations met defenders who can inflict far more damage with more modern weapons than previous wars suggested. The Union also tried to play out its naval superiority. The blockade of the South was systematically built up so that the Confederation could hardly export its cotton. At the same time, arms deliveries and other imports were made more difficult. Smugglers and blockade breakers tried to exploit the gaps, but the economic damage to the South was considerable. Without the ability to sell its cotton on a large scale, the Confederation lacked income to buy weapons and equipment abroad. The Confederation responded to the blockade with innovations. It built its own warships, including the famous CSS Virginia, an armored ship that fought against the USS Monitor at the Battle of Hampton Roads in 1862. This duel between the first iron warships in world history marked the beginning of a new era in seafaring and showed that technological innovations were also part of the Civil War. At the strategic level, it soon became clear that the war would not be decided by battles alone. For the Union, it was a matter of isolating the South economically and politically, systematically smashing its armies and gaining control of important rivers and cities. For the Confederacy, it was a matter of buying time, minimizing losses, and making the North worn down enough to give up. This dichotomy, offensive versus defensive, superiority versus determination, determined the entire course of the war. But the strategies also had internal limits. The Union had to learn that its superiority did not automatically lead to victory, but was only effective if it was used consistently. The South had to realize that mere defense without international support would not be enough in the long run. Both sides had to adapt to the reality of a modern war that demanded resources, organization, and the will of the population in equal measure. The dispute over strategy and tactics in the Civil War made it clear that it was not just about armies and battles, but about the ability to prepare an entire society for war. The North had the means and industry, but it had to learn to use it systematically. The South had the advantage of motivation and defense, but it faced the problem of limited resources. These contrasts shaped every decision and every battle, making the Civil War one of the most complex conflicts of its time.
Chapter 10: The War in the West, Mississippi, Shiloh, and Vicksburg. While the main armies faced each other in the East at Washington and Richmond, an equally decisive, if often less noticed, battlefield developed in the West. The West included the Mississippi Valley, Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, and the adjacent regions. This was about control of rivers, railways, and trade routes, which were of strategic importance to both sides. The Mississippi River in particular was the key. Whoever controlled this mighty river could split the Confederacy and cut through its supply lines. The struggles in the West should therefore make a decisive contribution to the victory of the Union. At the beginning of the war, Kentucky was a neutral state, but both sides tried to gain influence. It soon became clear that the Union had an advantage here. Under General Ulysses S. Grant, an officer who was initially little known, the Union began its Western offensive. Grant quickly proved to be a determined and intrepid commander who did not shy away from great risks. In February 1862, he captured Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. These victories opened the way for the Union to Tennessee and forced the Confederates to abandon their positions in Kentucky. Grant's famous unconditional surrender ultimatum at Fort Donelson made him a hero in the North. The Union's successes continued in the spring of 1862, when Grant led his army west and camped on the banks of the Tennessee River near Pittsburgh Landing. There, in April, the Battle of Shiloh took place, one of the bloodiest conflicts of the entire war. On the morning of April 6th, Confederate troops under General Albert Sidney Johnston attacked by surprise. The Union troops were unprepared and initially got into serious trouble. Many units fled, and it seemed that the Confederacy could achieve a decisive victory. But the Union stood firm. Grant showed nerves of steel in this crisis and regrouped his troops. In the course of the day, it was possible to stabilize the defense. In the evening, reinforcements arrived under General Don Carlos Buell, who turned the situation around. On April 7th, the Union counterattacked and forced the Confederates to retreat. However, the losses were staggering. Around 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing, more than in all previous battles of the war combined. Shiloh finally destroyed the illusion that the war would be short or easy. While Grant fought inland, Union fleets advanced on the Mississippi. Admiral David Farragut led a daring move in 1862 by sailing up the river with his fleet and, in April, taking New Orleans, the largest city in the South and an important economic center. This victory was a major blow to the Confederacy, as it deprived it not only of an important port city but also of control of the mouth of the Mississippi River. Now it was a matter of bringing the entire river into the hands of the Union. The pivotal point on this trail was Vicksburg, a town on the Mississippi River in Mississippi that sat on high cliffs and dominated the river. As long as Vicksburg remained in Confederate hands, the power was blocked. Grant took on the task of taking the city and began several attempts in 1862, but it was not until 1863 that he made his breakthrough. His campaign against Vicksburg is still considered a masterpiece of military strategy. Grant led his army through difficult terrain, had canals dug, and tried to bypass the city from different sides. Finally, he decided to make a daring maneuver. He marched his troops to the west side of the Mississippi, had them move downstream, then cross the river south of Vicksburg and attack the city from behind. In doing so, he cut off the Confederates from their supply lines. After several battles, including the battles of Port Gibson, Raymond, and Champion Hill, Grant besieged the city in May 1863. Vicksburg was bombed for weeks, while the population sought shelter in caves and suffered hunger. The Confederates under General John C. Pemberton held out, but on July 4, 1863, Independence Day, they finally surrendered. The capture of Vicksburg was a turning point in the war. It gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi River and separated the western states of the Confederacy, Texas, Arkansas, and parts of Louisiana, from the rest. This divided the Confederation geographically, and its supply of troops and material was made much more difficult. The Confederate defeat at Gettysburg in the east reinforced the impression that the tide was turning in favor of the Union. However, the fighting in the West had not only military but also political significance. They showed that the Union was able to use its resources effectively and weaken the South step by step. Grant, who consolidated his reputation with Vicksburg, was soon to play a central role in the entire war. His ability to take risks, survive defeat, and move on with determination made him one of the Union's most successful generals. For the Confederacy, the defeats in the West were particularly painful. It lost not only territory and resources, but also the confidence of many residents in the ability of its leadership to successfully wage the war.
In the western states, resistance to the Confederate government began, and loyalty to the cause of the South crumbled. The war in the West impressively showed that it was not just heroic battles that mattered, but strategy, logistics, and the ability to plan and execute major operations. With the capture of Vicksburg, the Union had won a decisive victory that had a significant influence on the further course of the war. The Mississippi was now a river of the Union, and the Confederacy was weakened from within.
Chapter 11. The War in the East, from Antietam to Fredericksburg. While the Union achieved significant successes in the West with Shiloh, New Orleans, and finally Vicksburg, the situation in the East was much more complicated. There, the main armies faced each other directly. The Union Army of the Potomac, which was to defend Washington and advance towards Richmond, and the Confederate Northern Virginia Army, which defended the heart of the South. Some of the most famous generals of the war fought here, and the bloodiest battles were fought here. From 1862 to the end of 1862, the war shifted from the banks of the Potomac River to the fields of Maryland, to the slopes of Fredericksburg, and time and again it became apparent how difficult it was for the Union to make progress in the East. In the spring of 1862, General George B. McClellan launched his so-called Peninsula Campaign. McClellan was an excellent organizer who rebuilt the Army of the Potomac after the defeat of Bull Run and gave it discipline. But he was also overly cautious, often underestimating his own strengths and overestimating the enemy's strengths. His plan was to take the army by ship to the peninsula between the James and York Rivers in Virginia and advance from there to Richmond. At first, he made progress, but he always hesitated, opting for sieges instead of quick attacks, and thus wasting valuable time. It was during this period that General Robert E. Lee first stepped into the limelight. Lee took command of the Army of Northern Virginia in June 1862 after General Joseph E. Johnston was wounded. Lee was an experienced officer with great strategic foresight who was willing to take risks. In a series of battles that became known as the 7-Day Battles, he forced McClellan to retreat despite being outnumbered. The Union's advance on Richmond failed, and the South hailed Lee as the savior of its capital. In the summer of 1862, the Union attempted a new attack over Northern Virginia. General John Pope was entrusted with an army to stop Lee. But in August, the Second Battle of Bull Run took place, and the Confederacy won again. Lee's troops, supported by Stonewall Jackson, cleverly bypassed Pope and forced him to a chaotic defeat. The road north was now open, and Lee decided to take a bold step. He marched his army into Maryland, hoping to find support in the border states and perhaps achieve a decisive victory on enemy soil. This advance led to the Battle of Antietam in September 1862. At Sharpsburg, on the banks of Antietam Creek, Lee's and McClellan's armies met. The battle was chaotic, bitter, and marked by unprecedented brutality. Entire regiments were mowed down on the so-called cornfield, corpses piled up on Sunken Road, later called Bloody Lane, and Union soldiers repeatedly tried in vain to cross a heavily defended bridge at Antietam Creek. By the end of the day, both sides had suffered enormous losses. About 23,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing. Antietam is still considered the bloodiest single day in American military history. Militarily, the battle was drawn, but strategically, the Union was able to claim a victory, as Lee had to retreat to Virginia. McClellan, however, had missed the chance to decisively destroy Lee's army. Despite his clear superiority, he hesitated to deploy reinforcements and lead risky attacks. Lincoln was frustrated by this caution and eventually dismissed McClellan from command. Nevertheless, Antietam was of great importance. Lee's retreat meant that his invasion of the North had failed. Even more important, however, was the political impact. Lincoln took advantage of the moment to announce the Emancipation Proclamation, which was to come into force in January 1863. This declared all slaves in the areas controlled by the Confederacy to be free. This gave the war a new moral dimension. It was no longer just a fight for the Union, but also a fight against slavery.
This prevented European powers such as Britain or France from officially recognizing the South, as they could no longer openly support a nation that fought for slavery. Antietam was followed by a period of renewed uncertainty for the Union. General Ambrose Burnside took command, but he was inexperienced in leading large armies. In December 1862, he marched with the Army of the Potomac against Fredericksburg, Virginia. There, Lee had entrenched his army in a strong position on the heights that lined the city. Burnside nevertheless decided on a frontal attack. The Battle of Fredericksburg became a disaster for the Union. Again and again, the Northerners stormed up the hills, only to be mowed down by Confederate artillery and infantry. The attack on Marye's Heights was particularly bloody, where Confederate soldiers stood behind a stone wall and repelled waves of attackers. In the end, the Union had over 12,000 casualties, while the Confederates lost only about 5,000 men. The defeat was devastating not only militarily, but also psychologically. Fredericksburg reinforced the impression that the Union in the East, despite its superiority, was incapable of winning decisive victories. Morale in the army dropped, and political opposition in the North increased. Many wondered how long the war would last and how many more victims it would claim. For the South, however, Fredericksburg was further proof of the strength of Lee and his army. The belief grew that further defensive victories could eventually wear down the North. The battles from Antietam to Fredericksburg showed the full severity of the war in the East. Here, the main armies were in constant confrontation, and each battle claimed thousands of casualties without a decision being reached. The war in the East developed into a grueling struggle that demanded everything from both sides. For the CDU-CSU, the question remained open as to how it could finally convert its superiority into a resounding victory. For the Confederacy, it was a game for time. Each attack they survived brought them closer to their hope that the North would eventually give up.
Chapter 12. The Emancipation Proclamation and the Role of Slaves. The American Civil War officially began as a conflict over the preservation of the Union. President Abraham Lincoln emphasized at the beginning of the war that his goal was not the abolition of slavery in the Southern states, but the restoration of national unity. But the longer the war lasted, the clearer it became that slavery was at the heart of the conflict. Without them, the rebellion could not be explained, and without them, the Confederacy could not exist. The question of how the government in Washington should deal with this institution increasingly came to the fore. Early in the war, situations arose that put the topic on the agenda. Many enslaved people fled as soon as Union armies approached, seeking shelter in the camps of the North. At first, the commanders did not know how to deal with it. Some returned the refugees, others hired them as workers. General Benjamin Butler in Virginia found a pragmatic solution. He declared runaway slaves to be contrabands of war, i.e., a kind of confiscated property that could not be returned to the enemy. This legal trick set a precedent, and soon more and more refugees were taken in by the Union camps. These developments made it clear that slavery could not be ignored. Every advance of the Union brought new refugees, and their presence posed new questions for the army as well as for politicians. Should these people be permanently free? Should they be allowed to work or even fight? And what did this mean for the future of the entire institution of slavery? Lincoln himself was initially reluctant to address the question openly. He knew that many border states, such as Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware, had remained in the Union but continued to allow slavery. If he had announced a policy of emancipation at an early stage, he might have driven these states into the arms of the Confederacy. In addition, public opinion in the North was divided. Many people morally rejected slavery but did not necessarily want to go to war for its abolition. Others feared that a flood of freed slaves could come to the North and put pressure on the labor market there. But military reality made a decision inevitable. The Confederacy based its entire war economy on slave labor.
Millions of enslaved people worked in the fields, in the workshops, and in logistics, freeing up white men to go to the front. Every move that weakened this system was a direct blow to the warfare of the South. At the same time, it became increasingly clear that the Union was not only fighting for territory, but for a fundamental moral question. Should a nation founded on freedom and equality continue to tolerate slavery? After the Battle of Antietam in September 1862, Lincoln saw the right time. Although the battle was militarily drawn, it could be interpreted as a strategic victory for the Union as Lee had to retreat. Lincoln used this moment to announce the Emancipation Proclamation. On September 22, 1862, he made the provisional declaration that from January 1, 1863, all slaves in the territories controlled by the Confederacy would be declared free. The proclamation was deliberately worded in such a way that it spared the border states. It applied only to the rebellious territories, not to the slaveholding states that had remained loyal to the Union. Lincoln thus retained his political balance. At the same time, the Declaration made it clear that the Union was waging the war not only to save the nation, but also to end slavery. The war now had a new moral dimension. On January 1, 1863, the final proclamation came into force. Lincoln signed it with a straight face, knowing full well that he was changing history. Legally, it did not emancipate slaves directly, as it was valid in the territories that the Union did not control at that time. But politically and symbolically, it was a milestone. It made the abolition of slavery an official war goal of the Union and effectively prevented European powers from recognizing the Confederation. For the enslaved people themselves, the proclamation was a signal of hope. Many fled to the lines of the Union as soon as the opportunity presented themselves. Thousands joined the Union armies as workers, cooks, nurses, or spies. From 1863, they were also allowed to fight in their own regiments. The United States colored troops grew to almost 180,000 soldiers in the course of the war. They played an important role in numerous battles and contributed significantly to the victory of the Union. The participation of African American soldiers was of enormous importance. It proved that the freed slaves were not only victims, but also active actors in their own liberation. At the same time, their use was associated with great risks. Confederate officers threatened to treat captured black soldiers not as prisoners of war, but as escaped slaves, and to either return them or kill them. Cases such as the Fort Pillow Massacre in 1864, in which Confederate troops under General Nathan Bedford Forrest murdered dozens of black soldiers after their surrender, showed the brutality with which the South responded to this development. For the North, emancipation also meant a deep cut in domestic politics. It divided public opinion. Radical abolitionists welcomed them enthusiastically and finally saw the goal they had fought for decades realized. Many ordinary soldiers accepted them as part of the war goal, even if they did not stand up for equality out of conviction. However, there was opposition, especially from Democrats, who accused Lincoln of turning the war into a crusade. Riots erupted in cities like New York in 1863 when Irish workers protested the draft laws and directed their anger at African Americans whom they feared as competitors. But military reality made a decision inevitable. The Confederacy based its entire war economy on slave labor. Millions of enslaved people worked in the fields, in the workshops, and in logistics, freeing up white men to go to the front. Every move that weakened this system was a direct blow to the warfare of the South. At the same time, it became increasingly clear that the Union was not only fighting for territory, but for a fundamental moral question. Should a nation founded on freedom and equality continue to tolerate slavery? After the Battle of Antietam in September 1862, Lincoln saw the right time. Although the battle was militarily drawn, it could be interpreted as a strategic victory for the Union as Lee had to retreat. Lincoln used this moment to announce the Emancipation Proclamation. On September 22, 1862, he made the provisional declaration that from January 1, 1863, all slaves in the territories controlled by the Confederacy would be declared free. The proclamation was deliberately worded in such a way that it spared the border states. It applied only to the rebellious territories, not to the slaveholding states that had remained loyal to the Union. Lincoln thus retained his political balance. At the same time, the Declaration made it clear that the Union was waging the war not only to save the nation, but also to end slavery. The war now had a new moral dimension. On January 1, 1863, the final proclamation came into force. Lincoln signed it with a straight face, knowing full well that he was changing history. Legally, it did not emancipate slaves directly, as it was valid in the territories that the Union did not control at that time. But politically and symbolically, it was a milestone. It made the abolition of slavery an official war goal of the Union and effectively prevented European powers from recognizing the Confederation. For the enslaved people themselves, the proclamation was a signal of hope. Many fled to the lines of the Union as soon as the opportunity presented themselves. Thousands joined the Union armies as workers, cooks, nurses, or spies. From 1863, they were also allowed to fight in their own regiments. The United States colored troops grew to almost 180,000 soldiers in the course of the war. They played an important role in numerous battles and contributed significantly to the victory of the Union. The participation of African American soldiers was of enormous importance. It proved that the freed slaves were not only victims, but also active actors in their own liberation. At the same time, their use was associated with great risks. Confederate officers threatened to treat captured black soldiers not as prisoners of war, but as escaped slaves, and to either return them or kill them. Cases such as the Fort Pillow Massacre in 1864, in which Confederate troops under General Nathan Bedford Forrest murdered dozens of black soldiers after their surrender, showed the brutality with which the South responded to this development. For the North, emancipation also meant a deep cut in domestic politics. It divided public opinion. Radical abolitionists welcomed them enthusiastically and finally saw the goal they had fought for decades realized. Many ordinary soldiers accepted them as part of the war goal, even if they did not stand up for equality out of conviction. However, there was opposition, especially from Democrats, who accused Lincoln of turning the war into a crusade. Riots erupted in cities like New York in 1863 when Irish workers protested the draft laws and
Chapter 13, Gettysburg and the Turning Point of the War. In the summer of 1863, the American Civil War reached a decisive phase. After 2 years of bloody fighting, there was still no end in sight, but both sides had already suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties. For the Confederacy under General Robert E. Lee, the victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville presented the opportunity to invade the North again and strike a decisive blow there. A victory on enemy soil could not only break the morale of the North, but possibly also secure the European recognition that the South so much hoped for. For the CDU-CSU, on the other hand, it was vital to prevent such a success. In this tense situation, the largest and probably most famous battle of the war took place. Lee was convinced that an offensive in the North was necessary. The South suffered from the blockade, the economy was on the ground, and resources became scarcer. A victory in Pennsylvania, at the heart of the Union, could turn public opinion in the North and perhaps force Lincoln to start peace talks. In addition, Lee hoped to plunder Pennsylvania's agriculture to supply his army and relieve the exhausted South. In June 1863, he marched north with about 70,000 men across Maryland to Pennsylvania. The Union reacted quickly. General George G. Meade took command of the Army of the Potomac shortly before the decisive confrontation. Meade was a cautious but competent officer who was aware of the urgency of the situation.
With about 90,000 men, he marched to meet Lee, and both armies met by chance in the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. What began as a clash of vanguards developed into one of the largest battles of the entire war in 3 days, from 1 to 3 July 1863. On the first day, Confederate troops under General A.P. Hill encountered Union soldiers who wanted to secure the city. At first, the Southerners succeeded in pushing back the Union troops and taking the city. The Northerners, however, retreated to the surrounding mountain ranges, especially Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge. These positions proved invaluable as they gave the Union troops a strong defensive position. The second day was marked by fierce attacks by the Confederates on the flanks of the Union. Fighting was particularly fierce on Little Round Top, a hill at the southern end of the Union line. Here, the soldiers of Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain from Maine defended their position in desperate hand-to-hand combat. When ammunition ran out, Chamberlain ordered a bayonet attack, which surprisingly threw back the exhausted Southerners. This moment is still considered one of the heroic highlights of the battle. Bloody battles also raged at other points, such as Wheatfield and Peach Orchard, but despite heavy losses, the Union held its line. On the third day, Lee put all his eggs in one basket. He ordered a massive frontal attack on the center of the Union position at Cemetery Ridge. Around 12,000 men under General George Pickett and other commanders marched across an open field that was more than a kilometer wide. Previously, the Confederate artillery had bombed for hours, but the effect was less than hoped. As the infantry advanced, they were taken under devastating fire by the Union's artillery and rifles. Despite their courage, only a few reached enemy lines, and most were repulsed or killed. This attack, known as Pickett's Charge, ended in disaster and sealed the defeat of the Confederacy. The losses were staggering. In total, both sides lost about 50,000 men together, killed, wounded, or missing. For the Union, the victory was dearly bought, but it had enormous strategic importance. Lee's army was severely weakened and had to retreat to Virginia. He would never again dare a major offensive in the North. For the South, Gettysburg was a blow from which it never fully recovered. At the same time, on July 4, 1863, just 1 day after Gettysburg, the Union had won another decisive victory, the capture of Vicksburg. This combination, a victory in the East and a victory in the West, marked the turning point of the war. For the first time since the beginning of the conflict, the Union had a clear advantage, both militarily and morally. The significance of Gettysburg extended far beyond the battlefield. It became a symbol of the Union's courage to sacrifice and determination. In November 1863, Lincoln visited the site to inaugurate a cemetery for the fallen. In his famous Gettysburg Address, he formulated in a few sentences that the war was not only being waged for the Union, but also for preserving a nation that was consecrated to freedom. In doing so, he gave the conflict an even deeper moral legitimacy. For the soldiers who had fought there, the memory of Gettysburg remained marked by unimaginable suffering. The fields, orchards, and hills were strewn with dead and wounded. Residents of the city still reported years later about the terrible scenes when corpses were buried and the stench of decay hung over the area. Many families in the North and South lost loved ones, and the tragedy once again highlighted the price of the war. But despite this death toll, Gettysburg was a turning point. It showed that the Confederation was not invincible, and it gave the Union new confidence in its cause. Lee remained a dangerous opponent, but his aura of invincibility was broken. The initiative now increasingly lay with the Union, and with generals such as Ulysses S. Grant and William T. Sherman, it was to use it to systematically bring the war to a conclusion.
Chapter 14. Sherman's March to Atlanta and the Sea. While the armies of Robert E. Lee and the Union continued to wear each other out in bitter fighting in the East, the West increasingly became the focus of warfare. One of the most important players there was General William Tecumseh Sherman, a close confidant of Ulysses S. Grant. Sherman was a man of clear ideas, determined, energetic, and often ruthless. He was convinced that the war could not be decided by battles between armies alone, but that it was necessary to hit the entire infrastructure and economy of the South. Only when the population felt that the war was destroying their livelihoods would the rebellion finally collapse. This conviction shaped Sherman's famous campaigns to Atlanta and later to the Atlantic. In the spring of 1864, Sherman took command of the Western Union troops after Grant had risen to become commander-in-chief of all Union armies. His task was to penetrate deep into the South and strike the Confederacy in the heart there. The first destination was Atlanta, an up-and-coming city in Georgia that was not only industrially important but also an important railroad hub. Atlanta connected the West with the eastern parts of the Confederacy and was therefore of inestimable strategic value. Sherman's army consisted of around 100,000 men, divided into three groups. Opposite them was General Joseph E. Johnston with about 60,000 Confederate soldiers. Johnston was a cautious commander who wanted to avoid a direct clash with the superior Union troops. Instead, he gradually withdrew, erected defensive lines, and tried to slow Sherman's advance. This cat-and-mouse game dragged on for weeks as Sherman's troops advanced deeper and deeper into Georgia. Lincoln and the government in Washington watched the development with great tension. 1864 was an election year, and the mood in the North was characterized by disenchantment with the war. After 3 years of sacrifices and defeats in the East, many people were willing to accept a compromise with the South. The Democratic Party, led by George B. McClellan, called for peace negotiations in its election manifesto. If the Union had not achieved a clear military success by the fall, Lincoln's re-election would have been in jeopardy. Sherman was aware of this political dimension and was determined to deliver results. In July 1864, Johnston was deposed by President Jefferson Davis because he felt his defensive strategy was too hesitant. He was succeeded by General John Bell Hood, a young, aggressive officer who relied on risky attacks. But Hood's offensive against Sherman's superior troops ended in catastrophic defeats. After several battles with heavy losses, Atlanta was unstoppable. On September 2, 1864, Sherman's troops marched into the city. The capture of Atlanta was a major blow to the Confederacy and a pivotal moment for the Union. News of the fall of Atlanta reached the North in time for the presidential election. It revived the belief in victory and secured Lincoln's re-election. This also made it politically clear that the Union would not break off the war, but would lead it to the end. Sherman, however, did not stop at the capture of the city. He ordered the evacuation of the civilian population and then burned down large parts of Atlanta. This was supposed to be a signal that the infrastructure of the South was being systematically destroyed. After the conquest of Atlanta, Sherman began his infamous march to the sea. With about 60,000 selected soldiers, he moved from Atlanta to Savannah on the Atlantic Ocean in November 1864. On this march, Sherman left his supply lines behind and fed his army from the country. His soldiers destroyed railways, factories, bridges, and plantations. They confiscated food, livestock, and supplies, often without regard for the civilian population. The goal was not only to destroy military resources of the South, but also to break the will of the population. This total war was a new dimension of warfare. Sherman was convinced that only by destroying the economic base and morale of the South was a quick victory possible. Many historians see this strategy as a precursor to modern warfare that targets not only armies but also society. The march left burned fields, destroyed villages, and a frightened population. It was a disaster for the people of Georgia, but a decisive success for the Union. On December 21, 1864, Sherman reached Savannah, which fell without much resistance. He sent Lincoln a telegram in which he conveyed the city as a Christmas present. This symbolic triumph underscored that the Union had now penetrated deep into the heart of the Confederation and was systematically crushing it from within. However, the march did not only have a military effect. He showed the inhabitants of the South that their government could no longer protect them. Many began to doubt whether the cause of the Confederacy could still be saved.
At the same time, Sherman's advance freed thousands of enslaved people who sought refuge in his lines. For them, the march was a path to freedom, even if the conditions were often harsh and uncertain. After Savannah, Sherman continued his advance north in 1865 through South Carolina, which was hit particularly hard as the birthplace of the secession. Cities like Columbia were burned down, and the destruction was even more extensive than in Georgia. Eventually, he marched on to North Carolina to join Grant's troops who were besieging Lee in Virginia. Sherman's march to Atlanta and the sea was one of the decisive turning points of the Civil War. It destroyed not only a large number of military resources, but also the moral foundation of the Confederacy. The population of the South now experienced the war directly, no longer only through reports from the front. The impression of the Union's inexorability spread, and confidence in the South faded. For the North, Sherman's success was a testament to the superiority of his strategy and resources. It showed that the Union was capable of controlling and paralyzing not only individual cities, but entire regions. The combination of Grant's systematic offensives in the East and Sherman's destructive march in the West made it clear that the South had no chance of sustaining the war in the long run.
Chapter 15: The Last Battles and Lee's Surrender in Appomattox. In the spring of 1865, the Confederacy was at the end of its strength. For 4 years it had fought fiercely, often with considerable success on the battlefields, but the Union's superiority in people, industry, and resources proved insurmountable. Sherman's march through Georgia and the Carolinas had devastated the country, while Grant, with the Army of the Potomac, encircled Lee and Virginia more and more closely. The final months of the war were a slow but relentless attrition that eventually ended in the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, a moment that remains a symbol of the end of Confederacy and the restoration of the Union. Since the spring of 1864, Grant had pursued a strategy of uninterrupted offensive. Instead of retreating after defeats like many of his predecessors, he kept up the pressure on Lee constantly. In bloody battles such as the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor, the Union suffered heavy losses, but Grant did not back down. He knew that his army was numerically stronger and received supplies from the industrial North, while Lee could hardly replace his losses. Eventually, Grant shifted his tactics to a siege of Petersburg, a city south of Richmond that was crucial as a supply center. The siege of Petersburg lasted almost 10 months. The fighting consisted of trenches, siege mines, and constant battles, a foretaste of 20th century warfare. The Union gradually cut off the railroads that served Petersburg and Richmond. Meanwhile, Sherman marched through South Carolina and forced more Confederate troops to surrender. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, saw catastrophe approaching, but he clung to the hope that the war could still be turned around by a fortunate circumstance. In March 1865, Lee made a last attempt to break through the blockade. At the Battle of Fort Stedman, he attacked the Union lines to gain time and space. At first he was successful, but the Union struck back and the attack failed. Lee's army was thus finally on the defensive. On April 2, 1865, Grant broke through the lines at Petersburg. Lee realized that he could no longer hold Richmond and ordered the retreat. That same night, Davis and his government fled the capital. On April 3rd, Union troops marched into Richmond, and the flag of the United States flew over the city again. Lee's army, which had once numbered more than 70,000 men, numbered only about 30,000 exhausted soldiers. Many were barefoot, poorly nourished, and desperate. They moved westward, hoping to unite with other Confederate troops in North Carolina. Grant pursued them tirelessly and cut them off. In a series of battles, including at Sailor's Creek, Lee lost thousands more men who were captured or killed. The embrace became tighter and tighter. On April 9, 1865, Lee reached the small village of Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. His army was completely surrounded there. His officers asked him to start guerrilla warfare in the mountains, but Lee refused. He knew that such a war would only devastate the country even more and cost countless lives, with no prospect of success. Instead, he decided to capitulate honorably.
That same day, he met Ulysses S. Grant at the home of Wilmer McLean, a citizen whose residence was chosen by chance as the place of surrender. The encounter between the two men became one of the most famous scenes in American history. Grant appeared in his simple uniform, dirty from the marches, while Lee appeared in impeccable attire, the symbol of an officer of dignity and pride. But the atmosphere was characterized by respect. Grant treated Lee with generosity and offered generous terms. The terms of surrender were simple. The Confederate soldiers had to lay down their arms, but were allowed to return home and keep their personal possessions, including horses. Grant knew that people in the South needed their animals to cultivate the fields in the spring and wanted to facilitate the return to civilian life. Officers were allowed to keep their sidearms as a sign of honor. This generosity impressed Lee and many of his men. News of the surrender spread quickly. Cheers erupted in the Union camps, but Grant banned public celebrations in the presence of Confederate soldiers to avoid humiliation. He wanted this moment to be marked not by triumph, but by reconciliation. It was a heavy blow to Lee, but he accepted that the war was over. In his address to his soldiers, he praised their bravery and urged them to return home as good citizens. The capitulation at Appomattox did not mean the immediate end of all fighting, but it was the decisive signal. Other Confederate armies laid down their arms in the following weeks, including the troops of General Joseph E. Johnston in North Carolina. Jefferson Davis was caught while fleeing, and the Confederate government ceased to exist. The war, which had claimed over 600,000 lives, was over. For the North, Appomattox was a moment of relief and triumph, but also a moment of deep sorrow. The immeasurable sacrifices could not be undone. For the South, it was the beginning of a painful defeat that meant not only the end of Confederation, but also the end of slavery and the old social order. Many people felt bitterness and despair, but others hoped for a new beginning. Grant and Lee's encounter in Appomattox became a symbol of how the war ended, not in revenge, but in a gesture of dignity and respect. Although Reconstruction was to bring many conflicts, this moment showed that it was possible to end a bloody conflict with a touch of humanity.
Chapter 16. The End of Confederacy and the Capture of Jefferson Davis. After Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, the Confederacy's military resistance was virtually broken, but formally the Southern state continued to exist for a few weeks. Other armies were still in the field, and the Confederate government under President Jefferson Davis was not yet ready to concede defeat. For many in the South, the idea of laying down their arms for good was unbearable, and some officers even considered continuing the fight as a guerrilla war. But the reality of the military situation, the exhaustion of the population, and the superiority of the Union left no doubt that the end was inevitable. Davis had left Richmond on the night of April 3, 1865, when it became clear that the capital could no longer be held. Together with members of his cabinet, he fled south, hoping to find a new base for the government. His goal was to reach the remaining troops in the West, especially in Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana, and to organize a renewed resistance there. He believed that the far west of the Confederacy, which was not yet fully controlled by Union troops, could provide a retreat to prolong the war. But this hope was illusory. While Davis fled, the remaining armies of the Confederacy gradually laid down their arms. General Joseph E. Johnston, who was in North Carolina after Sherman's campaign, saw no chance and surrendered at Durham Station on April 26, 1865. This surrender involved almost 90,000 men, making it the largest surrender of troops during the entire war. Soon after, the armies in the West also surrendered. General Richard Taylor surrendered in Alabama, and General Edmund Kirby Smith, who commanded the Trans-Mississippi area, surrendered in May. The last battles took place in Texas, where there was even a Confederate victory at Palmetto Ranch on May 13, although the war had de facto long been decided. But even there, it was soon over. Jefferson Davis's escape was closely followed by Union troops.
Before his assassination on April 14, 1865, President Lincoln had emphasized that the leaders of the rebellion had to be caught in order to underline the legitimacy of the Union. After Lincoln's death, Andrew Johnson took over the office of president and continued this line. The persecution of Davis was as important symbolically as it was militarily, because with his capture, the Confederacy was to be considered destroyed for good. Davis and his companions traveled through Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and finally Georgia. Fewer and fewer supporters joined along the way, and the group was constantly on the run from Union cavalry. Davis was determined not to fall into the hands of the enemy. Some of his advisors advised him to leave abroad, for example to Cuba or Mexico, but there was no safe route. On May 10, 1865, Davis was finally captured by Union cavalry in Irwinville, Georgia. Legend has it that when he tried to escape, he put on women's clothes to camouflage himself. But this story was probably exaggerated by Northern propaganda or invented to mock him. In truth, he was probably wearing a raincoat that he had borrowed from his wife. However, the Union used the episode to portray Davis as a coward, while his supporters continued to speak of his dignity and steadfastness. With Davis's capture, the Confederacy had finally collapsed. He was first taken to Fort Monroe in Virginia and imprisoned there. Many in the North demanded that he be tried for treason and sentenced to death. But the government in Washington was unsure whether such a process would be politically wise. On the one hand, there were doubts as to whether a jury in the southern states would really find Davis guilty. On the other hand, there were fears that a trial could deepen the wounds of the war. Davis remained in prison for 2 years without a trial before he was released on bail in 1867. He then lived in seclusion and remained a symbolic figure for the lost South until his death in 1889. While Davis was trapped and the Confederate armies laid down their arms, the difficult process of transition began. For the population of the South, the end of the Confederation was a shock. Many had believed in victory until the end, or at least hoped that a compromise would be possible. Now they saw themselves not only militarily defeated, but also politically and morally humiliated. The destruction left behind by Sherman's march and the fighting was omnipresent. Cities were in ruins, plantations were devastated, and the economy was in ruins. The end of slavery was particularly drastic. With the Emancipation Proclamation and the victories of the Union, it was effectively abolished, and by the 13th Amendment, which was passed at the end of 1865, it was also legally banned. For millions of former slaves, this meant the long-awaited freedom, but at the same time, an uncertain and often dangerous path began for them into a future marked by discrimination, poverty, and violence. The capture of Jefferson Davis marked the symbolic end of the Confederacy. Without a government, without armies, and without international recognition, the dream of an independent South had failed. The Union was restored, although deeply wounded. The people of the North celebrated the victory, but the joy was overshadowed by the assassination of Lincoln, which had shaken the nation shortly before. In retrospect, Davis is often seen as a tragic figure. He was an educated man, an experienced politician, and a former U.S. Secretary of War. But he put himself at the service of a cause that had been built on sand from the beginning. His persistence in defending slavery as unalienable made him the epitome of the Confederacy, and at the same time, a symbol of its demise. Thus, in the spring of 1865, the Confederation did not end in a last heroic battle, but in a creeping collapse sealed by its president. For some, it was a moment of liberation. For others, the beginning of a time of humiliation. But for the entire nation, it meant the opportunity to finally look to the future and began the long, difficult process of reconstruction.
Chapter 17. The Assassination of Lincoln and its Aftermath. The Union's victory over the Confederacy in the spring of 1865 was a moment of relief and jubilation for many people in the North. For 4 years, the war had shaken the nation, claimed countless victims, and plunged the country into a crisis whose outcome had long been uncertain. With the surrender of Lee and the capture of Jefferson Davis, the worst nightmare seemed to be over. President Abraham Lincoln, who had led the Union through those years of trial, was now able to reap the fruits of victory and devote himself to the daunting task of rebuilding. But the nation was not to linger long in this moment of hope. On the evening of April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater in Washington by assassin John Wilkes Booth. This murder not only tore a deep wound into the heart of the nation, but also permanently changed the course of the post-war period and the way we deal with the South. Lincoln had gone to the theater on Good Friday with his wife Mary Todd Lincoln and some guests to see the play Our American Cousin. The mood in the city was festive. Victory celebrations were taking place everywhere, and people felt a mixture of relief and joy. Lincoln himself seemed relieved, albeit exhausted by the years of war. He talked a lot these days about the future and the need to treat the South not with revenge, but with clemency. His famous second inaugural speech a few weeks earlier had already struck this tone when he spoke of tackling Reconstruction with malice toward none, with charity for all. But John Wilkes Booth, a well-known actor and ardent sympathizer of the South, saw Lincoln as the enemy who had destroyed the South and ended slavery. Booth had originally planned to kidnap Lincoln in order to force the release of Confederate prisoners. After the capitulation at Appomattox, however, this plan turned into the decision to murder. He believed that by killing Lincoln and other members of the Confederacy, he would give the Confederacy a new chance. On the evening of April 14th, Booth entered the theater unhindered. He was known there as an actor, and security precautions were only rudimentary. At around 10 p.m., he sneaked into the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head at close range. After that, he jumped on stage and reportedly shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," so always the tyrant, the motto of the state of Virginia. He broke his leg during the jump, but was still able to escape. Lincoln was immediately taken to a nearby house where doctors tried to save his life. But the bullet had caused 2 serious injuries. On the morning of April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died at the age of 56. For the nation, this was a shock that abruptly ended the joy of victory and turned it into deep sorrow. The reactions were overwhelming. A wave of mourning broke out in the North. Churches filled with people, streets became silent, and newspapers appeared with black mourning margins. For many, Lincoln had become not just a president, but a symbolic figure, a martyr for the cause of the Union and freedom. In the South, the reactions were more mixed. Some felt relief. Others realized that Lincoln's death would be a disaster, since he had been the one who had advocated a conciliatory Reconstruction. The persecution of John Wilkes Booth began immediately. Union troops chased him through Maryland and Virginia. After 12 days on the run, he was finally caught in a barn on April 26, 1865, and shot by soldiers. Several of his co-conspirators were arrested and later executed or sentenced to long prison terms. The assassination of Lincoln was not only a crime, but also a conspiracy aimed at overthrowing parts of the government. Although other attacks planned that evening survived, the act had already achieved its goal. It robbed the nation of its leader at a crucial time. The consequences of Lincoln's death were far-reaching. He was succeeded by Vice President Andrew Johnson, a Democrat from Tennessee who had supported the Union but did not possess Lincoln's foresight and skill. While Johnson continued the formal abolition of slavery, he showed little willingness to guarantee equal rights to freed African Americans. Under his presidency, many former Confederates quickly regained political influence, and the so-called Black Codes were enacted in the South to massively restrict the rights of African Americans. Had Lincoln led the Reconstruction, the course might have been different, perhaps less marked by bitterness and oppression. Lincoln's assassination also increased polarization in the North.
Radical Republicans, who had long pushed for a hard line against the South, now felt vindicated. They did not want to treat the former Confederates with leniency, but to punish them politically and economically. At the same time, the freedom of African Americans was to be secured, and their participation in political life was to be made possible. This attitude led to bitter disagreements with Johnson in the following years, which culminated in impeachment proceedings against him. Lincoln also occupied an almost mythical position in the cultural memory of the United States due to his assassination. He became a martyr whose death symbolically represented the victims of the entire war. His funeral procession ran from Washington to Springfield, Illinois, and millions of people lined the streets to pay their last respects. His image became a symbol of unity and freedom, and his words, especially the Gettysburg Address, became part of the national identity. But behind the grief remained the bitter reality. The man who, with his mixture of firmness and compassion, might have paved the way to a real reconciliation, was no longer there. Instead, a phase began that was to be characterized by mistrust, political struggles, and new violence. The Reconstruction of the South became one of the most difficult and conflict-ridden periods in American history, and its course was decisively influenced by the absence of Lincoln. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln was therefore far more than the tragic end of a single person. It was a turning point that changed the course of the post-war period, deepened the wounds of the war, and dashed hopes for a milder, more conciliatory new beginning.
Chapter 18. Reconstruction, and Conflicts. With the end of the Civil War in 1865, the United States faced a new, no less difficult task: Reconstruction. Although the Union had been saved militarily, the country was deeply divided. The South was economically devastated, and the question of how the liberated African Americans were to be integrated into society was unresolved. This epoch, which became known as Reconstruction, officially lasted from 1865 to 1877 and was marked by political struggles, social tensions, and a constant struggle over how far freedom and equality should really reach in the United States. After Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson took over the presidency. Johnson was a Southerner from Tennessee who had remained loyal to the Union, but remained conservative in his stance on slavery and black equality. He advocated reintegrating the former Confederates into the Union as quickly as possible, and was surprisingly lenient towards the elites of the South. Many former leaders of the Confederacy soon regained political office, and Johnson issued mass pardons. For many in the North, this was a betrayal of the victims of the war and of the ideal associated with emancipation. The situation in the South was chaotic. Plantations were destroyed, cities lay in ruins, railways and factories were devastated. Millions of former slaves faced an uncertain future. They were free, but often without land, without income, and without protection. Many were looking for their families who had been torn apart by the slave trade. Others were looking for work or trying to found schools and churches. But at the same time, they were confronted with violence, discrimination, and new forms of oppression in many places. As early as 1865, many Southern states enacted the so-called Black Codes, laws that severely restricted the rights of African Americans. These regulations forced them into employment contracts, prohibited them from carrying weapons, restricted their freedom of movement, and made them legally dependent on whites again in many areas. At its core, the Black Codes were intended to ensure that white supremacy was maintained despite the abolition of slavery. For many in the North, this was clear proof that the South was not willing to accept defeat. In Washington, therefore, the power of the radical Republicans, who demanded a hard line, grew. They not only wanted to occupy the South, but also fundamentally reshape it. These included granting political rights to African Americans, expropriating former slave owners, and introducing new social structures. Congress passed a series of laws that placed the South under direct military administration.
Divided into 5 military districts, it was controlled by Union troops until new governments were formed that recognized equality. A central instrument was the Freedmen's Bureau, an agency founded in 1865 to help former slaves transition to freedom. She organized schools, distributed food, and helped with employment contracts. Millions of African Americans gained access to education for the first time through this initiative. At the same time, however, the Bureau also supported poor whites who had lost everything in the war. Despite limited resources, this was a decisive step towards a new social order. Politically, Reconstruction brought about profound changes. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution had finally abolished slavery in 1865. This was followed in 1868 by the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed citizenship to all those born in the United States and guaranteed them equal protection under the law. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed, which guaranteed the right to vote regardless of skin color or former servitude. These changes provided the basis for civil rights in the United States and enshrined in the Constitution for the first time that equality was not just an ideal but a legal entitlement. But the implementation of these principles met with fierce resistance. Many whites in the South perceived Reconstruction as occupation and humiliation. They organized themselves into secret societies such as the Ku Klux Klan, which was founded in 1866. With violence, terror, and intimidation, the Klan tried to prevent African Americans and their white supporters from participating in politics. Lynchings, arson attacks, and night raids became a brutal means of informally restoring the old order. Despite these threats, many African Americans actively participated in political life. In the years following the war, hundreds of blacks were elected to local and state legislatures, and some even made it to Congress in Washington. This political participation was historically unprecedented and showed that Reconstruction could indeed produce a new society. But it was also fragile and constantly threatened by backlash. Andrew Johnson's policies led to fierce conflicts with Congress. The radical Republicans accused him of protecting the interests of the former Confederates and betraying the newly won rights of African Americans. In 1868, he was finally impeached, but narrowly failed. Johnson remained in office, but was politically isolated and without much influence. In the 1870s, support for Reconstruction began to wane in the North. Economic problems, including the financial crisis of 1873, diverted attention from the issues of the South. Many Northerners were tired of war and no longer wanted to station troops in the South. The Democratic Party, which remained strong in the South, slowly regained power. Finally, in 1877, Reconstruction officially ended with the so-called Compromise of 1877. Which settled a controversial presidential election campaign. Rutherford B. Hayes became president, and in return, the Union withdrew its last troops from the South. This cleared the way for the reintroduction of white supremacy in the Southern states. In the decades that followed, the Jim Crow laws were established, systematically excluding African Americans from political and social rights and enshrining a new form of racial segregation. Reconstruction was thus a contradictory chapter in Americans' history. On the one hand, it brought groundbreaking progress, the abolition of slavery, the enshrinement of civil rights in the Constitution, the first political participation of African Americans, and the establishment of new social institutions. On the other hand, it failed to secure these achievements in the long term. Resistance in the South, declining support in the North, and deep racial divisions prevented the freed slaves from being fully integrated into American society. Despite its failure in many areas, Reconstruction laid the foundation for the civil rights movements of the 20th century. The constitutional amendments that were adopted at that time remained in place and later formed the legal basis for the fight against segregation and discrimination. Even if the generation of the liberated often saw their hopes disappointed, the dream of equality was not finally destroyed. Reconstruction was thus a time of great opportunities and great conflicts. It showed America's potential to reinvent itself, but it also revealed the deep resistance that stood in the way of this renewal. The Civil War had ended slavery, but the struggle for equality and justice was far from over.
Chapter 19: The Social Consequences of War. The American Civil War not only had political and military dimensions, but also intervened deeply in society and changed the lives of millions of people permanently. With over 600,000 dead, it was the deadliest war in the history of the United States, and the wounds it inflicted were not only physical, but also social and cultural. Entire regions were destroyed, families torn apart, and the relationship between North and South was poisoned for decades. At the same time, the war brought about a transformation of American society that continues to have an impact today. One of the clearest results was the final abolition of slavery. Millions of African Americans who had previously been treated as property were suddenly granted freedom. For them, this was an epochal change, but one that came with immense challenges. Freedom did not automatically mean equality, and most former slaves were left without land, education, or economic foundations. Many found work as sharecroppers, i.e., as tenants of land who had to cede part of their harvest to the owners. This system often led to a new form of dependence and poverty that disappointed the hopes of many. Nevertheless, the former slaves created new communities, founded churches and schools, and thus laid the foundation for a self-confident African American culture. For the white population of the South, the defeat was a shock that went far beyond the loss of slaves. Many families had lost their sons, fathers, and brothers on the battlefields. Plantation economy and trade were on the ground. Cities like Atlanta and Richmond were devastated, railroads destroyed. The lost cause ideology, which emerged soon after the war, was an attempt to come to terms with this shock. It glorifies the war as a heroic struggle for independence, obscures the central role of slavery, and presents defeat as a tragic but honorable sacrifice. This interpretation shaped the self-image of the South for generations and increased the distance to the North. In the North, on the other hand, the war was an engine for modernization. The Industrial Revolution had received an enormous boost during the war years. Factories, railways, and banks had benefited from the needs of the Army, and the economy of the North continued to grow after the war. At the same time, the war brought profound social changes. During the war years, women took on many tasks that had previously been reserved for men. They worked in factories, ran farms, served as nurses or organizers of auxiliary services. Names such as Clara Barton, who later founded the American Red Cross, exemplify the new scope of action that women gained during this time. Even though social equality was still a long way off, the war was a catalyst for the women's movement, which gained strength in the decades that followed. Another consequence of the war was the change in the role of the federal state. Before the war, many people had perceived the federal government as a rather weak authority that left the individual states a lot of room for maneuver. The war, however, made it clear that a strong central government was necessary to preserve the Union. With the introduction of the first income tax, the expansion of bureaucracy, and the creation of national institutions, the war laid the foundation for the modern American state. The question of whether a federal state was allowed to leave the Union was also finally answered. The Union was indissoluble. The veterans of the war shaped society in many ways. Hundreds of thousands returned home, often maimed or traumatized. Many suffered from what would be called post-traumatic stress disorder today, but was not understood at the time. Veterans associations such as the Grand Army of the Republic in the North emerged to represent the interests of former soldiers and to keep their memories of the war alive. In the South, similar organizations were formed, which at the same time promoted the lost cause ideology and helped to shape the culture of remembrance in the spirit of the Confederation. The role of religion in social life intensified after the war.
Churches were a central place for both whites and blacks to come to terms with the loss and community. The African American churches in particular developed into centers of social organization and political mobilization. Not only church services took place here, but also school lessons, political discussions, and aid campaigns. They became the backbone of African American society and would later play a key role in the civil rights movement. The education system also changed permanently. The freedmen schools, which were founded during Reconstruction for former slaves, laid the foundation for a broad literacy of the African American population. In the North, universities and technical schools were expanded to support industrial development. Education was increasingly understood as the key to progress and social advancement. Socially, however, the war also increased tensions that had a long-lasting effect. Racism remained omnipresent in the South and was soon enshrined in new laws that massively restricted the rights of African Americans again. In the North, an immigration society grew that was marked by new conflicts as Irish, German, and later Eastern European immigrants struggled for work and recognition. The war had ended slavery, but by no means eliminated all social inequality. Culturally, the Civil War left deep marks. Songs, poems, and novels about the war found their way into American literature. Writers such as Walt Whitman, who had worked as a nurse, processed their experiences in impressive texts. Photography also played a major role for the first time. Images of battlefields such as those taken by Matthew Brady brought the horror of war directly into people's living rooms. Never before had a war been so directly documented. Last but not least, the war also influenced national identity. Many Americans began to see the country as an indivisible nation rather than a loose federation of states. The term "the United States" changed from a plural, "these United States," to a singular, "the United States." This linguistic change reflected the new political and social consensus that the fate of the country had to be shared by the country. The social consequences of the Civil War were thus complex. It brought progress and modernization, opened up new opportunities for groups that had previously been excluded, but also destroyed lives, homelands, and old certainties. For the South, it was a tragedy that meant the loss of an entire way of life. For African Americans, it was the beginning of a long, contradictory road to freedom. For the North, it was an engine of industrial and political development. Above all, there was the realization that American society after 1865 would never be the same as before. The Civil War had not only held the nation together territorially, but also reshaped it in its self-image and at the same time opened new wounds that would only heal many generations later.
Chapter 20: Culture of Remembrance and the Significance of the Civil War for the USA. The American Civil War ended in 1865 with the military victory of the Union and the formal abolition of slavery, but its traces continue to shape the United States today. The memory of the war, its victims, and its significance for national identity have been repeatedly reinterpreted, and instrumentalized over time. The Civil War is not just a chapter of history, but a constant point of reference in the collective memory of the United States, raising questions about freedom, equality, and national cohesion. Immediately after the war, the phase of mourning and commemoration began. Hundreds of thousands of fallen soldiers left families and communities in mourning. Cemeteries were created, monuments erected, and commemoration ceremonies held. The North, in particular, developed a culture of hero worship for its soldiers, who were celebrated as defenders of the Union and freedom. In the South, on the other hand, commemoration was more complicated. Although people mourned the dead, at the same time, a narrative developed that became known as the Lost Cause myth. This myth portrayed the defeat of the Confederacy as an honorable, albeit tragic, struggle that was fought less for slavery than for independence and state rights. The Lost Cause ideology romanticized the Southern Army and its generals, especially Robert E. Lee, and suppressed the fact that slavery was at the center of the conflict.
These competing narratives shaped national memory for generations. In the North, Lincoln remained the central figure of victory, a martyr who had given his life for unity and freedom. His words, especially the Gettysburg Address, became a moral foundation of American democracy. In the South, on the other hand, many clung to the idea that they were not fighting for the defense of slavery, but for a noble cause. This reinterpretation made it easier for the former Confederates to come to terms with defeat and helped develop a new identity as a proud, albeit defeated community. Over time, commemoration became increasingly institutionalized. Memorial Day, originally known as Decoration Day, originated in the years after the war when people began to decorate the graves of fallen soldiers with flowers. This holiday developed into a national day of remembrance for all those who died, but for a long time it remained strongly associated with the Civil War. Veterans organizations such as the Grand Army of the Republic in the North and the United Confederate Veterans in the South shaped the culture of remembrance and kept alive the camaraderie of the former soldiers. However, the memory of the war was not only an act of remembrance, but also a political instrument. In the era of Jim Crow laws, which systematically disenfranchised African Americans, the lost cause ideology in the South served as a justification for maintaining white supremacy. Confederate monuments were erected, which sent a message of political power rather than honoring the fallen, that the old order continued in spirit. At the same time, the history of the war was often distorted in schools and textbooks. The role of slavery was downplayed, while the bravery of the Southern states was emphasized. This historiography influenced the thinking of many generations and made it difficult to honestly work through the actual causes and consequences of the war. In the North, on the other hand, a patriotic narrative developed that portrayed the Union as indissoluble and interpreted the war as a necessary price for the preservation of democracy. But here, too, there were contradictions. While the emancipation of slaves was celebrated, the actual equality of African Americans fell by the wayside. The commemoration of the war was thus often selective. It emphasized unity and sacrifice without focusing on the unresolved problems of racial discrimination. In the 20th century, the memory of the Civil War gained new relevance. During the Civil Rights Movement, activists such as Martin Luther King Jr. deliberately drew on the language and symbols of Lincoln to support their demands for equality. The Lincoln Memorial in Washington, inaugurated in 1922, became a central site of these battles. King's famous speech, "I Have a Dream," in 1963 was deliberately held in this place to bridge the gap between the emancipation of slaves and the struggle for civil rights. At the same time, Confederate symbols continued to be cultivated in the South. The Southern flag, which had only a military significance during the war, became a symbol of regional identity, but also of resistance to equality and the persistence of racist attitudes. To this day, it causes controversy when it is shown on state buildings or in public spaces. The Civil War also lived on in popular culture. Novels such as Gone with the Wind or films such as the Hollywood film adaptation of the same name contributed to the romanticized view of the South, while other works such as Torches in the Storm or historical novels tried to show both sides. At the same time, the scientific debate remained a field of intense debate. Historians argued for a long time about whether the war was primarily fought over slavery or over the rights of states, a dispute that has now largely been decided in favor of the clear recognition that slavery was at the center. The significance of the Civil War for the USA goes far beyond historiography. He redefined the nation. On the one hand, the Union was confirmed as indissoluble. No state could seriously threaten to secede. On the other hand, the principle was enshrined that freedom and equality were not only ideals, but concrete political goals that had to be implemented. The constitutional amendments of the Reconstruction remained in place and formed the basis for the civil rights laws of the 20th century. But the Civil War also left unresolved conflicts. Racism did not disappear with slavery, but took on new forms. The violence of the Ku Klux Klan, the segregation of the Jim Crow era, and the social inequalities that still exist today show that the struggle for equality continued. The Civil War ended the old order, but at the same time opened a new, long process of struggle for civil rights. Today, the Civil War in the USA is understood both as a warning and as a source of national identity. Museums, memorials, and battlefields such as Gettysburg or Antietam are places of learning and remembrance. They attract millions of visitors every year and are a reminder of the price the nation paid for its unity and freedom. At the same time, the Civil War remains a topic of political debate when it comes to symbols, monuments, or the question of how history should be told. The significance of the war for the United States is therefore complex. It destroyed the system of slavery. It created the conditions for a modern federal state. It shaped the national identity, and at the same time, it revealed the deep fractures that accompany the country to this day. It is a source of pride, but also of shame, a symbol of sacrifice, but also a memorial to the cruelty of which people are capable. The culture of remembrance continues to move in this field of tension to this day. The Civil War remains a touchstone for America's understanding of itself, as a nation of freedom, but also as a country that must constantly fight its own contradictions. Perhaps this is precisely where its lasting significance lies. It reminds us that the values of the Union cannot be taken for granted, but must be fought for and defended again and again.